Dear Emmanuelle, it's an honor to discuss with you today to discover more about your sustainability vision and the actions of La Banque Postale on biodiversity. Could you please start by presenting yourself as well as your overall vision for sustainability and how it is designed in your institution, La Banque Postale?
Sure. So I will be quick because we could talk all night about it. But let us say that La Banque Postale has asset management with its subsidiary Tocqueville Finance has been geared towards sustainability for quite a while. We did launch our first ethical fund in the 90s, so that was last century. Since then, obviously, we took a turn that was a very important turn for us, whereby we said that 100% of our funds, our open-ended funds, would be SRI. The reason for that was twofold. As you know, the finance industry has actually picked up the sustainability theme with a lot of focus. And we did not want to self-proclaim ourselves SRI. So we thought, okay, let us use a label. So we chose mostly the French state label, and we applied that to all the funds that are eligible to that label. And we also chose to do that at 100% because we did not want to be opportunistic. So that's why we thought 100% SRI was to be our mantra.
Why less, indeed? And is biodiversity already an integral part of the strategy? How is it integrated?
Well, biodiversity in itself has not been as much acknowledged as climate, although both of them, climate and biodiversity, are intertwined. But in terms of the focus on climate, you can look at the number of COPs, 27 COPs on climate, whereas there have only been 15 COPs on biodiversity. Yet for us, we believe that biodiversity is a major topic in itself. And if you're here, of course, you know about biodiversity issues, but a few examples have been striking for us. I've heard that 70% of the global biodiversity has disappeared since the 70s, which is actually quite a lot. I think that about 1 million species right now are at risk of extinction. This is also significant. And when we think about food and the 8 billion individuals that we are on Earth, pollination, as you know, is also decreasing quite a lot. And if it does actually contribute to 35% of agriculture, but if there is no more pollination, how will we feed 8 billion of people? So that's why we've looked at biodiversity, and all of that stems mostly from human activities. So that was on the gloomy side. On the less gloomy side, there are two good news, and I will be very quick, Natacha. The two good news are that regulation is actually advancing at a very fast pace. So we have SFDR, we have the European taxonomy, and in France we are the lucky ones with a specific article for institutional investors. And the second good news is that you have a number of companies now that are inventing processes or solutions to alleviate or even restore biodiversity loss. So this is the reason for which we think there is quite a lot of hope.
Thank you for a message of hope. You mentioned regulation. I am myself proud to share that La Banque Postale was a pioneer signatory of the Finance for Biodiversity Pledge, now a very active member. Could you tell us about the origin of these commitments at La Banque Postale and maybe the role of regulation, the French regulation for this? Are we advanced? Do we consider our market advanced?
I think I'll start with the second part of your question. I think that France is actually very advanced on regulation. That's Article 29 of the law which is called the Energy Climate Law, compels institutional investors to assess the biodiversity risks that they're exposed to, and it also forces them to project and disclose long-term goals on how they will tackle those risks. So I think in terms of being at the forefront of the European scene, France has been great. In terms of why we chose at La Banque Postale Asset Management biodiversity as a theme, we worked quite early on environmental issues. We did launch our first environment fund in 2009, so obviously that was quite a while ago. But biodiversity didn't gain that much traction in the world until recently, and the hard thing for an investor when talking about biodiversity is looking at scientific measures. What does it mean, biodiversity loss? What does it mean for us to assess if a company is actually negatively impacting biodiversity, and to what extent? And can we invest in that company or not? And recently, the great thing is that there have been a number of actors which do help investors like us with scientific tools where we actually can understand and measure biodiversity loss. So I would say that as opposed to climate, biodiversity in terms of measurement, in terms of solution, has probably gained less traction than climate. But the great thing is that it actually is catching up, which is the good news. So we are super happy about that.
That's great. From what you said, I really get the sense that the mobilization of financial institutions to reverse natural loss is possible and absolutely necessary in a context of urgency. So thank you for saying all this. Can you let us know more about your new biodiversity funds and its goals and investment themes?
So yes, we've launched a biodiversity fund, but that in itself, I think, is just an example of how we've tackled biodiversity within the organization. And let me tell you a few words about the framework. So we've articulated a biodiversity policy, which in itself is interesting because it is super exhaustive. We've used all the levers that we can use, that an asset manager can use. And we chose to align with the objectives of the global biodiversity framework. So that framework is the global reference, of course, and it has defined 21 specific key actions or targets. And we wanted to contribute to as many as possible of those targets. And actually, so the policy that we've articulated does contribute to 16 out of those 21 targets. So that's for the global policy and what we wanted to achieve. The other interesting part of that framework is that we've seized every opportunity to link and exchange best practices with those who actually have those practices. So we've been signatories with a number of associations. You've mentioned them, but the Finance for Biodiversity Pledge, for instance, is one of them. That is important because that also gives us feedback. We contribute what we know, what we've learned, but we also get the feedback and important information about how tools are developing, how scientific research is advancing, and so on and so forth. So that's important. The third thing that we have done for biodiversity is once you have the global framework with the policy, once you have aligned with some external parties, what we did is that we embedded biodiversity in all the non-financial criteria that we look at when we invest in companies. And so it's not only investing in the biodiversity funds. For every single investment in any one of our funds, and again, we run 56 billion of assets, we look at biodiversity, and the criteria for biodiversity account for 20% of the total non-financial criteria that we use. So this is significant. We want biodiversity to really be part of what we do. And again, we are 100% SRI, so that's the whole, all of our products. And the last thing we did in that framework was to partner. We are not scientists. We are investors. We do not know how to measure. And for that, we need guidance. We need bodies with a lot of data. And we chose to partner and to have a specific methodology with CDC Biodiversity, which has been working for many years on the subject, as well as Carbon 4, Carbon 4. I think that's how they would talk about themselves in English. And that those two partners do help us to measure the biodiversity footprint of the activities of all the companies that we want to invest into, or that we invest into. And within that framework, we thought, okay, let's actually prove that it works. So that's how we launched a pure biodiversity fund. So when I say a pure biodiversity fund, it is because a number of investors have mixed climate and biodiversity. As we said earlier, those two topics are clearly closely intertwined. But we think, again, that biodiversity in itself warrants a specific action. Hence, we have a pure biodiversity fund. So you won't be surprised that this fund is SRI, of course. We labeled it Article 9 under SFDR. It's a global fund, an equity fund. And we use in that fund all the levers that an asset manager can have. And the levers are, first of all, we exclude companies which have a heavy negative footprint on biodiversity and which do not have a remediation plan. And those ones we don't want to invest. Then we look at those companies which have an important, a significant footprint on biodiversity again, but which have a remediation plan. And in those companies, we engage with them on a bilateral or collective basis in order to make sure that they focus on that plan and deliver the plan. So that's the second type. And then the third option is we invest in companies which actually provide actual solutions to restore or reverse biodiversity loss. And that's regenerative agriculture, sustainable forestry, sustainable food, etc.
That's great. I was about to ask you if you have examples to share with us, but you already actually did. Maybe for our last question then. The market is rapidly evolving, as you said. Biodiversity is catching up. More and more financial institutions are committing to the protection of biodiversity. We hope that this momentum will only grow to implement the global biodiversity framework, as you mentioned. What would you like to say to your peers about lessons learned post-COP15, or maybe about how to develop their own biodiversity policies?
First of all, I would like to say to cheer up all the financial institutions or investors, asset managers that are tackling the biodiversity topic. I think the more actors there are, the more research there will be, and the more engagement we can do with companies. So in the end, this is the impact that we want to have on biodiversity. So I'm super happy when I see the number of funds pertaining to biodiversity or the mixed biodiversity and climate grow and grow. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing I would say is that the science is, the state of the art is evolving. For instance, we can measure the impact of activities of a company on biodiversity, but this is mostly static data. What we want to do is make sure that little by little, those scientific bodies that help us to measure the impact of activities on biodiversity are not static data, but what we can capture the progress. So as of now, we certainly can measure and limit the negative impacts, but we are not able yet to measure the positive impact. So I think I'm expecting all the ones who have the data and the scientific mind, and clearly it's not easy, by the way, to measure biodiversity. I mean, for all of you, it may look easy. You may think, well, it's not rocket science, but after the research that we've done, it is close to rocket science, right? So it's not easy. So that's the second thing. Let us make sure that we continue to progress with the science in order to track the positive impacts. And the third thing is that the great news of COP15 and generally the previous COPs is that focus on biodiversity is emerging as a topic in itself. I think that now people have understood that when we talk about climate, we talk about 2050. That's a long time. But when we talk about biodiversity, we actually can have an impact, and I'm talking not about investors, but about the companies that produce those solutions. We can have an impact in a relatively fast time. We can restore nature in compounds that have been built of steel and concrete and have a positive result, a natural result, and restore natural capital within a few months or years. So that is the great news. The acknowledgement of biodiversity in itself will help alleviating the biodiversity destruction that we've unfortunately engaged into.
Thank you for a really forward-looking vision and ideas. It's a great transition calling to our next speaker about data, so thank you for that too. It was a pleasure discussing with you, and that's it for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Natacha. Thank you all.
Thank you, Emmanuelle.